For the live audience, a warm welcome. Thanks to have you back. This is already episode number 22. And as usual, our agenda, welcome. Welcome to everyone who is eager to learn or get the latest news around KQL. We'll then, as usual, share some updates, articles, references we've come across. Then today our guest is Purav. He will introduce himself later in more detail. Then we have something to learn about KQL, where Johnny will show us a few things. And lastly, as usual, what did you do with KQL this month, where we share some of the queries or topics we've been working on by applying KQL in our daily life. So in terms of the news, not too much this month, but as I always go across the interwebs and try to find anything related to KQL that I consider worth sharing. Here is an article about common KQL mistakes in threat hunting, which is actually quite interesting. So let me quickly open that and at least give you kind of the, let's call it co-pilot abstract of it. So what Eugene is talking here about, Mehmet, he was, by the way, on our show earlier, about a common mistake. It's a great article, and basically it's all about, potentially leaving out data. So what he's describing is that sometimes, you are expecting a 0, but you might actually get, an empty value. And that basically means that if you were to filter on an integer, like, okay, give me everything that is below 2 or 0 or 3, etc., you might actually miss out those, rows where there is no value at all, because it's a null value, right? And as, for example, he's highlighting further down below, what if you did gather information about file information, let's say in Defender for Endpoint, and you might not get a value, but the file could still be malicious, right? And bottom line, I recommend to read the full article, but basically the fix is that, if you're threat hunting or you're data mining, and you try to narrow down data, where you're looking at, numeric values to be greater or smaller than, to also consider, the is null operator here, so that you don't miss out on those particular rows. Yeah. The next topic we want to bring up, and Johnny is going to talk about that in more detail, but there's also a lot of KQL to be applied in that area. So about 1.5 weeks ago, Microsoft publicly announced a new solution within the Microsoft security stack called Microsoft Security Exposure Management. And if you happen to have a Microsoft Defender solution running in your tenant, like Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint, you definitely want to take a look at the new blade called Exposure Management, and see about all the great data that we see here. So it's really, helping us to see a correlation between identities that are related to high privilege roles. It allows you to basically see an attack path. So potentially, this user is logging on that machine, and therefore, an attacker could elevate to higher privileges through that path. So from a KQL perspective, and we'll talk about that later in more detail, definitely a great area to look at. And then last but not least, we also had that topic already earlier. Oh, let me go there. Yeah, Johnny a while ago talked already about the Parse-KV operator, and I also did something with that operator this week, which I'll show later. But this is also definitely an article worth reading if you are looking into parsing data and make use of the Parse-KV operator in your KQL queries. Good. And as mentioned, not too much new stuff around KQL. And with that, I would actually like to leave the stage to Purav. And I'll let you introduce yourself and have you talk about your KQL topic today.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks, Johnny, for having me. So hey, guys, I'm Purav Desai. I'm a Microsoft 365 incident responder in financial services with over 4 years experience in the whole Microsoft security stack. And I started with KQL when I was a SOC analyst, doing various threat hunting queries for alerts, as well as providing enrichment for vulnerability management type things. What I'm going to talk about today is a different kind of KQL, but with that, let me just start sharing my screen. And as you can see, there's links there to connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can check out my GitHub series as well. So let me just share the screen, and if someone can let me know that's come through, that'll be helpful.
So we can see your screen in edit mode.
Okay, brilliant. Let me just go full screen. Can you still see that?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay. Cool. So, so my topic is KQL, but not the one you're familiar with, right? So everyone that's in attendance now and listen to prior shows by Johnny and Alex would be familiar with Kusto query language. So this is KQL, but of a different kind. So what is this KQL? So this KQL is actually keyword query language, right? So keyword query language is used within the Purview compliance portal. Some of you guys may have dealt with that. That's compliance.microsoft.com. And particularly within that portal is a solution called M365 eDiscovery. And eDiscovery effectively allows you to, retrieve content of interest from SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, Teams, etc. Right. So for the purposes of this slides and presentation, when I say KQL, I mean keyword query language. If I'm referring to Kusto, I will call it as Kusto. So if you hear me saying KQL, I mean keyword query language. And if I say Kusto, then I mean Kusto query language. So how does this differ from Kusto, right? So those of you guys familiar with Kusto will know that the syntax is basically a table. So you need to have security events or device events, a table where all your information is collected. And then your objective is basically to craft the query in such a way that you're refining the data that you get at the end of it using operations and conditions, right? Now, KQL or keyword query language works on a sort of a property value kind of JSON pair. And we'll see some examples of that soon. But one thing to remember is that you can combine multiple properties in keyword query language using sort of or and operators. So how do you get started with keyword query language, right? So for any newcomers that are new to this KQL, there is also a query builder, very similar to what you have in Kusto. For advanced hunting, which basically kind of pre-populates these conditions. So you can see some of them here, like keywords, date, sender, size, etc. Right? And if you choose one of these conditions, it basically gives you contextual operations to that condition. So if you choose like the date condition, it will say, do you want the date, after a specific value, or before a specific value, or between a specific value? So it will change based on which condition you choose. And after you apply the conditions, you can basically switch to the KQL editor, which you can see here, which will show you the kind of KQL version of what you've chosen, right? So how that looks like is something like this. So firstly, what you notice is in the screenshot, you can see that it's already auto-completing, right? So those of you familiar with Kusto will know IntelliSense, which basically aims to help newcomers, but also existing veterans, speed up their workflows by auto-suggesting commands or operators, etc. So for keyword query language, it's very similar. So you can see, for example, I've started typing in RECI, and it's auto-suggesting recipients and recipient domains, right? This date property is an example of the between condition that I mentioned earlier. So this is saying, find me, whatever content this is, whether it's SharePoint or Teams or OneDrive, between these two dates, right? And the reason why I touched on the KQL editor is because sometimes you do need to kind of enter this mode to basically override some of the values in the query editor. So for example, there is a sender property, and by default, it does select, pre-populates the sender, with your existing members in your entry ID tenant. But what if the sender was external, right? They're not going to be in your entry ID tenant. So you'd have to get the KQL off that and kind of override the value. And here's another example of the IntelliSense at work, right? So you can see, for example, the author condition. It's suggesting whether you want author equals, author contains, or author not equals. So that kind of gives you an idea of not only the conditions, but also how you can manipulate them. So if you know the exact value you're searching for, you can use the equals, but equivalently, you could use the contains, which is very similar to what you can do in Kusto as well. So there are actually some hidden conditions, right? So not many people will know this if you're just going by the guided query builder in the portal. But these are well documented in this Microsoft Learn page that you can visit. But one example is document link. And if you look, right, when I search for document link, it's not suggesting any condition like pre-populated. But in the KQL editor, it is completing it with IntelliSense. So the KQL editor will on the back end know which conditions and fields are there, even if the query builder doesn't. And why document link is useful is because if you're trying to retrieve a file from OneDrive or SharePoint, you can't be more specific than the document link because that will be unique. It will show the full path of the SharePoint site, the person's OneDrive, the folder, and then finally the file with the extension. So, that's the most specific and granular that you can be. And with eDiscovery, it's important to remember that you should only be retrieving the content that you're expecting to, because if you collect more than you should, then it could be a violation depending on your regulatory and compliance sort of standards.
Yeah, I think that's always the balance, because you have from your security side, you want to see everything, but then from HR and policy and compliance, they don't like it if you just look into everything. So you should have a straightforward case.
Yeah, correct. And that's why you can almost build up these KQL queries for certain use cases and kind of reuse the KQL and just change the values. In the same way, for Sentinel queries, I'm sure most of us on the call would have a Kusto kind of cheat sheet of certain queries that we use over and over, and we just change the values. You can do something very similar here to kind of build up your own repository. I'm not sure in the community how many of these KQL queries have been contributed, so maybe it's something to look at. But yeah, for now, you can kind of play around with these and get that specific criteria that you want, and then basically reuse it for future. But yeah, Alex, you're spot on with saying that, you should be as specific and granular as possible, because compliance teams wouldn't be happy if you see more than you're supposed to. So thanks for that. And then moving on to kind of errors, right? So the portal is smart enough, especially the KQL editor, to very quickly identify errors as you're typing the syntax, but also it provides you helpful context to remediate those, right? So you can see, for example, here there's a dash. The dash could be symbolized as a not operator, so it's kind of warning you about that. And the way you'd prevent that is basically you would apply a bracket before the date condition. So it would be bracket date. In fact, we saw that previously, right? Something like this, because that way you still maintain the dash, but it won't interpret it as an operation because it's within a bracket. Then you can also see that and actually has an operator of capital A and D. So it's knowing that small a and d doesn't actually make sense as a term. And then again, author sender, it should actually be sender author as a condition. And then dates is not recognized because it needs to be single, just DATE. So with these kind of helpful errors and suggestions, you can very easily remediate your issues. And I really like the way this provides the context, because there's nothing worse than when you're coding or crafting these queries and you don't know what the exact error is. Like some platforms may just show you the line, or some platforms may give you some hints, but this is very good context, especially for newcomers. So now let's move on to like our first use case, right? So let's say we're trying to retrieve an email of interest. This could be based on an alert, or based on a suspicion, or based on an investigation, however you found that email you need to retrieve. And let's say you knew some metadata about the email, right? So you knew the subject, you knew the sender, you knew the recipient and the date. how would the KQL keyword query language look like, right? So this is a rough kind of syntax. Obviously, I've redacted the fields here, but you can get a rough idea. So one thing to stress is, I mentioned at the start, you can combine operators, right? So in this case, I'm saying, give me the emails that have either the subject 1, subject 2, or subject 3 as values for the subject. So that's a way to combine it. And if you look, you can see a double bracket here, right? So you've got one kind of part here, or this part, and all of that is encapsulated within a double bracket, preceding and suffixing it. And then you have your next condition about from, right? So who is the sender that this email is coming from? And similarly, who is the recipients? And then, finally, what is the date range that you expect those emails to have been sent or received? So this allows you to then retrieve, emails of interest based on these conditions. And then our second use case is a document of interest, right? Again, it could come up because of an alert, because of an investigation, or because of a suspicion that arises. And let's say for that document, you knew the author, you knew the title, you knew the file extension, and you knew the created date. How would that KQL look like, right? So you can see it here. You can say author equals, in this case, I've just kept it generic, John Smith, right? But typically this could be someone in your organization. The title, document 1. And one thing you may notice, like eagle-eyed viewers at the moment for the show or people on demand, is that there's a colon symbol here. If you remember earlier, we said that the colon symbol is a contains, right? So let's say the document is actually called document 1-test, right? If I just apply this criteria as it is now, it will be captured because it's saying contains document 1. Whereas if I changed it to equals, it wouldn't come up because the actual name of the document is document 1-test. So that's important to remember whether you're using the contains colon criteria or the equals exact match kind of criteria. And then we have the file extension, right? So let's assume it's a Word document, so it's going to be docx. And then let's say the created date is any time after or equal to the 17th of March. You can't specify time in keyword query language, but you can do date. So, all the kind of date properties like created, sent, date, etc., would just be on the day level. You wouldn't be able to do it at the time level. But maybe that's something Microsoft can work on if they're listening. And then some improvements, right? So some people on the call or familiar to the show, to the KQL show, may be aware of the Microsoft 365 roadmap. So this is an item that got added recently, which basically is providing you some enhancements to those KQL conditions that we touched on, right? So one is, for example, message ID. So message ID could really help with that email use case that I mentioned because it allows you to be even more specific. Because if you can identify the message by its message ID, that would be unique, right? And that wouldn't occur across multiple dates or things like that. Any instances of that message would have a different message ID. So that's one way you can uniquely identify it. And how you'd find that is you could find that from the audit log. So within the Office activity kind of table in Sentinel, or if you're using third-party themes, you would look for an operation of send. And that would basically then show you the message ID. But equivalently, you could get it from MDO or Microsoft Defender for Office, which allows you to see emails incoming and outgoing in your organization for people that are on Exchange Online. And then the second one is sensitivity label, right? So this again could enhance that document use case that we mentioned, because if you have a policy that says all documents must be classified with a sensitivity label, and that that document of interest should be, let's say, confidential, you can add that as a condition to say, find me the documents with the date, criteria, all of that we saw, but also that the sensitivity label equals confidential. And the way you'd find that is from the audit log. I don't know the operations off the top of my head, but there will be operations like file accessed or document created or similar, which will basically have your sensitivity label condition in there. Or equivalently, you could find it from MDCA or Defender for Cloud Apps, because that enrichment is also there. So again, this is not something that's there present currently. So if you're trying to use KQL keyword query language currently, you wouldn't have these conditions, but they will start rolling this out in April, so next month. So one to look out for. But the feature ID is 381452. You can search that, or you can visit this URL, which will then basically show you this information as well. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions from Johnny or Alex, otherwise I'll stop sharing. Or anyone in the audience.
Now, for me, I'm now pondering a bit on your comment. If there are any places where people share their keyword query language files. And I think it would be nice to create a repository with just some basic things, because everyone is doing the same. You have your workflow, if you investigate a subject or a user or a mail flow, the flow will be the same for every company. I think it would be nice to create something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Or even if you have, do you know if it interacts with Jupyter Notebooks, for instance?
I don't off the top of my head.
Okay.
It's not something I've come across, no. But what were you thinking? Like, were you thinking it would do some threat hunting proactively or something, or?
Yeah, or maybe generating some notebooks where you can just do basic response.
Yeah, something to explore. Not something I'm aware of, but yeah, could potentially interact with that.
Making a note to not forget.
Yeah, because that's the other thing, right? Like all of us, well, I know you guys are MVPs, but all of us that are passionate about Microsoft, like we try and contribute content back to the community, because the Learn docs and webinars and stuff are great, but the actual kind of field experience, what we can share, redacting customers and stuff like that, is invaluable to other people getting started, right? So what you said about the repository with keyword query language could easily help someone kind of new to Purview or new to eDiscovery.
Alan is commenting, Polyglot Notebook should work. Just
interesting. Have you used Polyglot Notebooks? It's not something I'm familiar with.
Me neither. But it's in VS Code, so that's
nice.
Maybe also worth mentioning for those that aren't familiar with the eDiscovery tooling itself. So a use case, and please correct me, Purav, as you're more seasoned in using this more often, but the use case is really that, maybe after a security incident or maybe also an HR type incident, it's not just enough to have the metadata that we usually would have in Sentinel or in the Defender platform, where we have information about the file hash and maybe the sensitivity label. But this is really when we actually need to get to the content of the information, right? So where maybe we actually, we're not going on SharePoint and just like in a directory gonna do a search down hundreds of thousands of documents. Or maybe you as an administrator don't even have access there. So the whole purpose is really, okay, we have evidence of a specific document or email where we actually need to get access to the document or the email content itself. And that's where we submit this KQL query. System will start searching. It will provide us with the results. And if needed, we are then also able to actually extract or download the content in a managed way. So people typically also who can perform those activities in a tenant need to have special privileges so that they are actually allowed to search for the data, taking into account all the privacy and the regulations that are available. But also are allowed to actually look into that data. That's also why all those activities are also visible in the audit log. Control the controller, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's fairly accurate, Alex. And one thing to touch on with, like you mentioned about permissions and right privileges, right? Even a global administrator doesn't have access to eDiscovery by default. You need to be a member of the eDiscovery manager role group. So that's how segmented it is. But yeah, you're right in terms of everything is audited from an eDiscovery perspective as well. And what you mentioned in terms of triggers, yeah, typically it's used for like litigation and compliance investigations, but there is an emerging need for incident response, right? Like if, for example, you had a malicious file on a SharePoint site, currently, like if it was a Microsoft signature that detected it, it would be blocked or quarantined, right? But what if it's not? What if you've had threat intel from third-party sources? How would you collect that file? There isn't a way to natively do that, as far as I'm aware, with Defender for Office or Defender for Cloud Apps. So the only way would be to, collect that file as it is using eDiscovery. And similarly, for example, let's say certain documents were modified erroneously. So, they had some suspicious credentials added, API keys, whatever. How would you then find that version that was the offense that caused the investigation in the first place? All of those kind of things eDiscovery really shines on. And yeah, I think a lot more security kind of folks should pay attention a bit more, I suppose, to purview compliance and eDiscovery, because there are incident response and security use cases. But traditionally, it was always used for legal and compliance sort of needs.
Yeah, I remember it from the old days, like, oh, I lost an email or it's already in archive. Can you please bring it back? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, maybe let's ask the audience. Anyone using eDiscovery or have been in touch with the Microsoft Purview compliance portal already? Have been there? Looks like not.
Yes, you can do both, Scott.
Just, yeah, I've used it in a previous role, and it was one of those cases where nobody knew how to use it, and I was kind of given the task to do some setup investigation. And one of the things I didn't know that, the writing of the keyword was quite intuitive.
Me, the line is a bit crackling. I'm not sure if it's me.
No.
Yeah, I've got a Bluetooth headset. Is it really bad?
Yeah, that's not really coming through. Maybe another question, Purav, you might know. When I go to the compliance portal and I look under eDiscovery, I see a standard and a premium. Is there any differences in regards to the query language here of what we can do or not, or is that unrelated?
Yeah, there are differences. And in fact, there's actually a third kind of component to eDiscovery, but it's just not within the umbrella, which is called content search. So the way to think about it is there's 3 levels of eDiscovery. There's the wide content search, which you can apply KQL to, but you would typically do them on like SharePoint locations or Exchange locations. eDiscovery standard allows you to kind of do that same search, but within the context of a case. So you can add specific people to the case, it's more granular permissions wise, etc. Whereas content search is available across the whole tenant if you have that role in place. So let's say, for example, I have the eDiscovery manager role, but let's say Johnny in my tenant creates a case. Unless he adds me explicitly to that case, I can't see it. Whereas if he was to do a content search, I could see it. Now touching on premium, right? So with premium, the main difference is you can add custodial data sources. So if I pull in Johnny as a custodian, it would say, hey, this is Johnny's OneDrive, this is Johnny's Exchange, these are the Teams channels that Johnny's a member of. It allows you to be more specific to that custodian. That's one main benefit. Apart from that, you also have the option to what's called commit the search to a review set. And the best way to think about this is like, let's say Johnny sends an email. I keep using Johnny as an example, if you don't mind. So he sends an email outbound with an attachment, right? When you collect that with eDiscovery standard, you would see the email metadata and you would see the attachment, but you wouldn't actually be able to open the attachment to kind of preview it and potentially export it. But with eDiscovery Premium, you can kind of preview that attachment. So you could see what suspicious things maybe Johnny added in the attachment, as well as metadata of the attachment. With Premium, you also have options to export you mentioned like exporting the items, right? Like downloading, etc. With Premium, you have the option to export it to an Azure storage account. So that way it's much more secure rather than downloading locally. And you also have options like when you put data on hold, because one thing with eDiscovery is if the data is not retained, you're not going to be able to recover it. right? So your retention policies need to be in place, legal holds need to be in place, things like that. And with Premium, when you apply those legal holds, you have the option to send notices to the custodians to say, hey, your data is now on hold for XYZ investigation, etc. You don't have to use that as a mechanism, but it's offered to you within that. And the last thing to touch on is the licensing. So if you've got E3, you're only going to get Content Search or eDiscovery Standard. If you've got E5 or E5 compliance add-ons, you'll get eDiscovery Premium. So at high level, those are the main differences.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just noticed as I go into my portal that somewhere down the road I actually also use this. So let me share. There was a use case from a customer, and he wanted to know, what files were actually, viewable by external people. Now, if you have Defender for Cloud Apps, there's also a way to do that by basically, looking at the files and then applying some filters based on the sharing settings. But yeah, if you have very, very much data, the Cloud App interface, at least that was my finding at the time, didn't do too well. Especially if then also you want to have a copy of that data and further analyze it. So this will be a search for viewable by external users equals true. Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing to add to this, right? So let's say that document was shared in a Teams chat, but it was shared using, well, maybe most of your audience might know, but modern attachments, right? So where it kind of links to the document rather than attaches the file. Mm-hmm. With eDiscovery Premium, you can recover that file even if it's just linked to it. Whereas typically, if you recover that chat log, you just get the attachment link, not the actual document. But with cloud attachments and eDiscovery Premium, you can recover that actual file as well.
Okay.
But yeah, that KQL that you showed, the viewable external users, it's not a condition, again, in the query builder. You need to know the KQL for it, which your customer seems to have known or is in the documentation. So just another example of hidden conditions.
Yeah, well, now that we talk about it, I go down the memory lane, and yes, indeed, I don't know where I found it, but it took me a while because, as you mentioned, it was not in the in the documentation. So going back to the idea of maybe also establishing some public repository for the community, I think would definitely be helpful. Yeah. Yeah. And let's see where we can get that one put. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Anything else around the other KQL?
Not off the top of my head, but I just hope Microsoft renames one of them, because when I'm getting asked what's the KQL for this, my first question is, do you mean Kusto or do you mean keyword query language? So yeah, hopefully they'll rename one of them, but we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, we have you back anyway with a good example from this month. So then I suggest we move on to our next agenda topic, which is learning KQL, and Johnny is going to share something with us here.
Yes. Because I had two subjects, so let me start. Here we go. So the first one, I wanted to talk something about data tables and scoring, because one of the things I tend to run into is most of the times when we create a query, a result can be true or false. But for instance, back in the days, I created a detection when a atypical travel and an unfamiliar signing properties were combined. And if those two were triggered within 10 minutes of each other, then we will get an alert. But the problem is that if you have like an informational or both are low, then the probability of a compromise is much lower. So in one of my iterations of my query, I started to say, hey, if my unfamiliar signing properties was high, and then the other one didn't matter, then it would trigger an alert. But what you then get is if your atypical travel has a high severity alert and your unfamiliar sign-in properties doesn't, then it can be a false positive. Or so I started thinking about ways to do that, and one of the things was to rate or score the incidents. So what I wanted to show today is, for instance, here, if we look at my security alerts, this is my playground, so I have a lot of fun alerts. And over here we can see the alert severity. And to just be sure that we have all the right alerts, we can do this. Let's just move it a bit back so we have a little more data. So we have informational, low, medium, high alerts. So what I started doing was create a table, and the data table allows you to define columns and the data types, because in Kusto every column has its own data type. And in this case, my alert severity column is a string, and then my score is an int, because that way we can play with numbers. So what we then do is we want to combine the severity lookup table with the alerts, and you can do that either by a join or by a lookup. And the difference between a join and a lookup, usually when you do a join, your left side should be the larger side. And did I say it correct? No, in join, left should be the smaller one. And in the lookup, the left can be the bigger one, because that's for performance. So the next step would be to use the data table in combination with the security alert, and then we do a lookup to see how it goes. So in this case, in the end, we should have all nice scores from 8 till 1, and that way we can rate it. So for instance, what we can do is we can say, hey, we want to have a rating per source, because you have the Azure Security Center, the Defender for Cloud Apps, or see how it's called in the product name. So what we now have is, hey, we have, so we did the table, we did the lookup, and then account, account per product name, and also the score, because after summarize, these are your aggregations, and you do it on whatever you place in the back. So for instance, we can see, hey, Azure Sentinel, we had 127 alerts, and the score based on the severity was 647. We could also add, for instance, let me do a small modification. We do next average score. And then we have an average score per item. You could also divide it, the score by the count, whichever you like, but for now this works out. Then we can see, hey, our security score of a security center, the Defender for Cloud Apps, is always informational, at least in my testing plane. And my Defender for Office one is also always a 1. And you can see the most criticals are usually coming from Sentinel. So this way you get a feeling with severity versus product. And like I said, I used it, I will post it somewhere in the future. I used it to upgrade my detection for the combination of the alert severity of the unfamiliar sign-in properties for a new device in combination with the atypical travel for the movement of a user account. And it works really nice, because if you have a large environment, then if you just filter on high or you use medium, then you get 10,000 alert in a month. And this way it's easy to play around and to score your alerts. And you can even use the scoring then to dynamically populate your alert severity. But that's a whole different subject.
Yeah, and what I like about this approach is because you could of course also do just the security alert query and then do a case and then build all those cases, which then would make your KQL query look more complex than needed. Whereas if you have had those data tables, you basically copy paste them, do the lookup, and do a quick enrichment.
Yeah, and this is also nice because you can also do it with watch lists or with external data, but with the data table on the fly, you populate your data.
Yeah, it's funny when you were showing the slide before you went to the demo, I thought initially in my head, I was like, he's going to do that using case. So when you did the data table, it kind of surprised me. But I've seen data table before, but I didn't see the lookup. So lookup very reminds me of like, in Excel, we have VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. So this is pretty cool. I didn't know about this operator, the lookup operator. I've never used it. So learned something new. Thanks, Johnny.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, just go ahead, Johnny. I'm looking for some more lookup examples that we have at hand that we looked at in the past to share.
Okay. And
but until I'm finished Googling myself and my repository, just continue.
let's see, we have someone typing. Let's see if it's a common or a notion. No bragging with lookups. Cool. So in the next thing which we were talking about, all the new goodness of the security exposure management. When you go to nowadays to the Defender portal, now I have all the exposure goodness in here. Quick question of Scott. I'm wondering if you could use lookup to build a threat score for users based across all alert source tables. Yeah, you can basically you assign a value to something, and you can make like a score of all the alerts to see the criticality level, or you can also use the score in a make series, for instance. Let me just. Because if we do, so let's do this. Make series. Let me just cheat a bit because I'm not entirely sure about this sequence. Make series. Okay, yada yada yada. Make series. Now we do average score on time generated from ago 14 days till now in steps of 1 day. And then was it by product name? So now you can see, for instance, a score by day. And that way you can see, hey, 2 days ago in my Sentinel environment, I had some more events than usual. And Azure Security Center, the Defender for Cloud, it's one of my VMs is constantly being scanned, and every day it generates an alert. Hey, I'm being targeted by some malicious IP address. I think, does that answer your question a bit, Scott? Yes. Okay.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah. Let me also, before you move on, Johnny, quickly iterate on the lookup. So first of all, how did I find out? Little reminder, KQLsearch.com, we have a great search option for the operator, right? So here you can enter lookup. You will find that there's also an IPv4 lookup, which by the way is also super useful. But in this case, lookup, and guess what? I found my own script. And this, by the way, is still work in progress. But what I'm doing here, I'm trying to write a detection for the removal of critical software. Now, this isn't critical, but I can't use the real software that I have in my customer's environment. So I play around with this. But that's for another time what this is all about. What I'm doing here, I'm basically here also creating a data table where I have references to the MSI GUI, the version. And as you can see here below, I basically do the same, right? Lookup. Yeah, I could have joined this also, but lookup is simply a little bit less code and can also be useful. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, back to you.
I'll share once again the zip. So I wanted to talk a bit about the new exposure management. So in here, in exposure management, everything is divided in three streams. You have device, identity, and cloud. And all the data is then in attack paths or in exposure insights. And the good thing is all these items are also available in advanced hunting. So you have all the new data, and for this data, we can play around a bit. Let's see. No. Too many tabs. Let's just start at the beginning. So we have edges and we have nodes. Nodes are basically the objects, and edges are the connection between the objects. And you can also use the graph operators, the new ones, to make brilliant graphs. But for some reason, I can't seem to. I haven't figured out what I missed, why it wasn't connecting. But I'll give a bit of show on the table. We have the edges, which have labels. So let's see what kind of labels. So a label of an edge, the connection can be that it contains something, affects, be a member of, has a role on, can authenticate to, can authenticate as. You know, the connections between two items. And those things you want to relate to the nodes. So for instance, if I would say one, we have one node, can be a CV. Let's do a distinct node label. You can see all the types of nodes we have. So all the Azure stuff is in nodes, and also users, subscriptions, groups. So what you can do with the nodes is you can see, hey, what kind of items does my subscription have? Or which users are logging into which devices. So if we go to device, we can say exposure nodes, where node label equals device. And we have some devices. So in this case, let's see, I populated some VMs to show some things, but let me just check. Okay, so the thing with it did detect it, but not completely. I wanted to show some query where we would see the domain controller, which should be the device role in the end, and the authentications to it. But we can do it a bit different. Now, if we just say, let's be a bit blunt, where star contains, and I should have one. So normally you query it through the node properties. In the raw data, you have all this goodness. And then you can show your domain controllers, for instance, because back in the days, when you wanted to target your domain controllers in a query, you had to first look at the device network events, see port 88 traffic, and then if it's a server with port 88 traffic, then it could be that it's domain controller. And now you can make a domain controller table just by doing a let statement to make a list. And now let's see if we look at the exposure edges where star contains. This way it will show all my edges related to the domain controller. And we have CVEs, but in this case, I wanted to show users, but let's see if it's okay. So it does have users, source node label equals user. So in this case, we can see one account is allowed to authenticate to my domain controller. In this case, it's my Defender for Identity Group Managed Service account. But as you can imagine, in a large environment, and if this is running for like a couple of maybe 24 hours, then you could also see all the users that have permissions to authenticate to the domain controllers. And it can be really nice also to make detections on that or on certain vulnerabilities, because now you can also quite quickly see, for instance, if an edge is connected to the internet, or if a node is connected to the internet and it has certain CVEs, then you might want to handle it more quickly. So that was my main take on the
I can maybe add some things. So if you maybe go quickly to settings.
Settings.
Yeah. Defender XDR. And critical assets management. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So basically, out of the box, what the exposure management already tries to help us is, if you maybe can collapse on the left side, so we have a little bit more space.
No, but I can.
Yeah. So you see domain controllers, you see SCCM, you see roles, domain admins, and it does its best, although today I was missing 2 domain controllers somewhere, to basically already, identify them. And an easy thing that we can do is also based on group membership. Now, previously, we maybe use the identity info table to find users that do have certain Azure AD roles, but that only worked when I did not use PIM, because if I have PIM activated, the identity info table would only show the assigned role when I actually have the PIM role activated. So that's a no-go. And here I have more static options, right? And I mean, the whole idea behind this, as it's called exposure management, with just a few lines of code, I can find out, where do people with domain admin rights log on? What are supposed admin workstations? If I then find out, well, these are just regular laptops, I can do that with a few lines of KQL query. I also want to highlight that, a few KQLCafe sessions ago, we spoke in Microsoft Sentinel about the RG operator, right? Where we could also query the Azure graph, right? Resource graph. So, to find information about our subscriptions and all the resources that are in there. Now we also have that information, as you saw before, here in the exposure management. So we do not only see, the assets, let's call it like that we already had before Defender, like devices and identities, but actually we also have access now to resources. So, and we can draw that line between, okay, which users, can potentially connect to that virtual machine in our subscription in that resource group. Yeah. So the primary idea is, of course, to make visible, if you maybe want to go on the left side on the exposure management in the menu. Yeah, and then maybe go on attack surface.
Yes.
And then show the map. So that is basically representing Johnny's world. Yeah. And then if you click on attack paths, depending on how much the system already learned. Yeah, okay, he didn't. So if you go back to map and maybe just enter your own username. And I also noticed in some tenants, it's already more ahead of collecting data. Yeah. So if you just select one, and you will see those relationships. Once the system has, continue learning and have enough information to show the relationship, you can nicely play with, Johnny has. I think if you right-click on the AAD groups, you can play with those relations. You can say, okay, who is a member, or who can connect to. So if there will be a device in the mix, you can right click on it and play with the, various, let's call it, activities like can log on to, or has RDP access to, or the other way around, a device, what protocols does it support? Does it have the RDP service running, etc. So if you like to do some data mining, and if you have access to exposure management, you'll be busy for a while in uncovering maybe new things. And as I just posted this week, by looking into a number of tenants, I have that luxury that I do have access to a number of tenants. And my finding is really, admins, please stop using your high privileges on regular desktops. You'll be amazed to actually see where people all log on to. Yeah.
One question, right? Because you mentioned access, and obviously this is quite a new service. Do you know what the RBAC roles are for this? Like, do you need something like security admin, or do they have exposure management?
Yeah, right now I'm gonna disappoint you. So there's no Defender RBAC yet for it. As per the official documentation, you need to be a global admin, a security admin, and I think something more, security leader, I believe. But right now there's no definite RBAC for it. Yeah.
By the way, this graph also quite nicely shows the edges and the nodes. So the nodes are my KW G123 and my account. Those are the nodes. And the edges are the connections between. So there's frequently logged in by, can authenticate as, and has credentials off. And those are the edges which connect the nodes.
Yeah. And in Lively Tenants, when you click on the attack path, you'll see a whole list of all the various scenarios that the system identified, like people with different roles that have access to a domain controller, members of that group, that can log on there, etc., based on the telemetry it's receiving. But definitely recommend, like we would do with any other new table that comes across our KQL keyboard, is to, do some distinct on the various attributes that are in the table. To look at the JSON format, the nested fields that are available, the category. So there's node properties, like the additional fields. We see a lot of node properties, raw data, categories, to kind of find out, okay, am I now looking at data? Am I looking at devices? Am I looking at identities? We can further filter that down. Am I looking at cloud identities or on-prem identities? So definitely a lot of cool use cases to, first of all, maybe, identify weaknesses, or also, as I already saw someone doing today, posting a query in a detection rule. Yeah. Good. What else do we have?
I think Scott is still typing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's still related to the question of Purav, so that's good. So I think next up is your what did you do this month, Alex?
Okay. And well, actually, being so excited around this exposure management, I just started with some simple stuff. I found out that, for example, on devices, RDP, which devices actually have RDP enabled and on which devices is the remote desktop service actually running. So here we see that's basically a simple one. So I'm not even joining with edges now. I'm looking at the nodes. I'm looking at the node label device. I do want to know Windows because RDP is running there. I'm interested in the devices that are onboarded into Defender for Endpoint. I then want to know the friendly operating system name. I also now want to get some information about the RDP service and the status, whether it's actually running, and whether it's actually accepting connections. So, okay, let me try here. If I run that in my tenant, give me a second.
Oh, and we're not seeing your.
Yeah.
Okay. And all the goodness is, by the way, the one Alex is parsing the raw data, and that's for each entity or node. You should check raw data because there's a lot of cool new fields in to play with.
Okay, because I see there. Okay, good. Let me quickly do that correctly. Okay, yeah, good. So let me share that. I'm waiting for the day where Teams just can read my mind what I want to share, so I don't have to press the button all the time. I'm just gonna share my full screen. So what I see here, I apparently, here I do see, okay, RDP service is running. It does allow connections, etc. So that's the type of information we can collect. Another one I did was, just as I mentioned before, we can now also get information about managed identities. And if you happen to work with Sentinel and now and then get a security incident alert, you get those nice long numbers that are the object IDs, but you have no clue, what the application name is actually behind it. And although I haven't confirmed that, but the idea is, of course, that hopefully now, maybe in some enrichment queries, I can now enrich those funny object IDs with actually a name, right? So here I see the names of my managed identities. So if you have those, alerts like unusual resource deployment or whatsoever, now instead of just having this AAD object ID in an incident, we might now also be able to enrich that with some human readable data. And then the last one, also related to the exposure management. For example, let's say I want to know about all my critical assets, identities first. And this actually relates to this. So, come on. So, yeah, I mean, UIs are nice. I prefer raw data. So if I want to have all those identities that we just saw, I'm basically, come on. Good. Takes a little while until he knows. Yeah. There we go. I have basically the list of all my critical identities that have a criticality level, between 0 and 4. And this, relates to what Johnny was showing before, that if we go to the system settings, Defender XDR, critical asset management. So as I mentioned before, there's some defaults here. I can, by the way, also create my own definitions. But what I did, here it says very high, because I can define those criticality levels like tier 0, 1, 2, and 3. And that means that as soon a user is member of one of those groups, the user basically also has a reference to the criticality level. So I did not specify the user to be critical, but because he's a member of, let's call it, a critical basket that he's is in. I can do the same also for my devices. So Johnny spoke about the domain controllers before. Let's do another new tab and quickly bring in all that. I do the same. Now I also want to maybe see, what is the role of my device. And here we see I have just one domain controller. So I see it automatically got that role assigned, and because I declared it to be tier 0 level, it automatically got that level. So no rocket science, just playing a little bit around with the data model to familiarize myself with all the information we can get out of these additional tables and the exposure schema.
To add to that, you can also add your own groups statically or dynamically to also assign the criticality levels to it, because criticality is from 1 till 5, and then you can tag it to a dynamic or static group.
Yeah. Good. And then the last one before I give it back to Purav and Johnny. I had another case where I actually went back to what I learned from Johnny with the Parse-KV command. So in this case, customer wants to have more visibility about the netsh commands, and to allow us to distinguish between legitimate activities and non-legitimate ones, or maybe firewall rules that are being added by people that do have certain permissions, but we don't really want them to do those things, or when you have totally locked down your environment and you're not allowing local merge of firewall rules, you might want to do a check when you're installing software packages during testing, whether those software packagings are actually adding firewall rules. So for that, I basically went on a journey and tried to make the netsh commands that are including advanced firewall rule to basically parse out all the possible strings that we can have in there. And then as a result, in this example, depending on what options are all in the command line, I get more or less attributes that basically help me to create more visibility about, okay, was the firewall rule actually adding, removing the application, so the rule name, which application, protocol, whether it was an inbound or an outbound rule, whether the action was allow or deny, whether it was actually enabling it, which profile was modified, and then just for my double checking, again, showing the whole command line that was basically being parsed with Parse-KV. Yeah. And as I was showing off to Johnny the other day, he told me, well, you could have done that smarter. So give it to me, Johnny. What could I have done? Or
because the process is quite good, but you can add in one single Parse-KV, you can add all your key value pairs or your key pairs, and you don't even have to add them in the same order. So if you add the program and the profile, you can add them in which order you like in a single line.
Okay, so let's take a look if I actually have some. Yeah.
Can you zoom in a bit?
Yeah, sure. Let me actually share the screen. Yeah. So for example, here we already see the system. Now, if you use a systems management system that is deploying stuff, you might, for example, want to rule out, where the account name is system, and to actually weed out, the potentially suspicious activities, right? So here we saw Sam, right? He executed actually, the command by first running a command prompt, again, actually executing the firewall commands. Yeah. Okay, so how would you make this better?
If you go on line 7 and create a white line between line 7 and 8.
Yeah, let me make this a little bit larger for you. Okay, so oops. Okay, here we go. Yeah.
And then if after string on line 7 you have name : string.
Yeah.
Then you add a comma.
Yeah.
And then you can now between the brackets, sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
And then space. And then you can add program : string.
Okay. There you go. Yeah.
And then you can do
yeah. So you're basically saying that as long as my pair delimiter and KV delimiter are the same,
yes,
or I can trust the greedy mode that we heard about. So the Parse-KV, if you read that article that we just shared earlier in the show, the Parse-KV tries to help us by having some built-in logic about how to deal with when something is in quotes, and it tries to help to think for us. Yeah. Okay, great. So I could basically continue like that, and just make this whole query down to probably a few less lines, right?
Yeah, and the good news is you like I said, you don't have to put them in the right order. So if you have, for instance, your parsing syslog, and at one point the vendor decides they want to swap around fields, then if you use the extract command, then you of the parse command, you might have some issues.
Yeah.
But with this, as long as your pair and your key delimiters are good, then the query will keep running.
Okay, great. Good. You see, we never stop learning. Yeah, that was basically from me what I did this month. So I hand it back to Purav.
Yeah, thanks. No, good insight from both of you. Definitely learned some new things. So I just want to share something quickly. I'm just cognizant of time. So one thing that I've done within KQL, so some of you guys may know the audit log series, right? I started at the in the beginning slide when Alex was presenting about deciphering UAL. So what you can do is you can actually get all your audit data to Defender for Cloud Apps if you have Microsoft 365 and more specifically Office 365 connected. So here's an example where typically this would be operation, but in Defender for Cloud Apps syntax, it's action type. So I'm saying Cloud App events table where action type is mail items accessed. I think, Johnny, you touched on raw event data having a lot of useful information. Definitely true for this audit log event as well. But after you do multiple parsing, so initially you have to parse the JSON and let's say look at the folders object. The folders object is actually an array. So what you need to do is then choose the first element of that array, which is this bracket 0. And then once you've got that, you then look at the folder items object within the folders object, which is also an array, and you look at the 0 item. Once you do that, eventually you'll start to get other details as well. So you could get like the path by going from that array dot path. And then finally, you can get the message ID by going from the third one, internet message ID. And then obviously you can use project to tell you which fields are of interest. Obviously here I've redacted UPN, but instead of this GUID, you could have the UPN of the user. And you can also see the path as well as the message ID. So one thing that sticks out to me immediately is like, why is this message missing a message ID, right? I'm not sure. I haven't investigated it to that, but that's something that, could be some cause for concern. Initially, you may think because it's in the deleted items, but as you can see, the one below it is also in the deleted items. And yeah, this is just showing, inbox, but also other paths within the inbox. So if users have multiple folders, this will show you the exact path of where that message is. So you can see MS folder within inbox, and then CCP, which is the customer connection program that Microsoft have for private previews and stuff within that MS folder. And then you can get the message ID. And as we touched on earlier, eDiscovery keyword query language will be adding message ID to their future development in terms of conditions. So this is one way where you could get the message ID equivalently from Defender for Office or the audit logs using Kusto query language. And then secondly, so I touched on the deciphering UAL series, but if you look at that series and look at part 5 is where we explored the Get-RoleGroupMember operation, which is basically a way, it could be tied to the MITRE technique of enumeration, right? If an attacker enumerates role group members, they could target them with specific phishing emails and things like that, assuming they're already in your environment to run this command in the first place. So again, Cloud App events would be the table. The action type would be, or operation would be get role group member. Again, the raw event data comes in clutch, right? So you need to pass that out as JSON. But here you don't need to have multiple arrays and objects and things. You can just use the first pass JSON .parameters .result status. And here you can see that at this timestamp, eDiscovery Manager, for example, role group was enumerated successfully. And same for the one below. So all this is just to show that another way to consume the audit logs that I've been showing natively in Purview Audit in my series, you can also do it using Kusto query language if you have Office 365 connected to your Defender for Cloud Apps, which would allow this Cloud App events table to populate. But yeah, that's all I had to share, what I've been doing with KQL this month, Kusto query language, that is. So hopefully that was insightful to some.
Yeah. Very cool. If you could maybe quickly go back to the previous slide you showed.
Yeah, sure.
Exactly. Maybe give a little hint for people that are new into KQL or maybe never ran into that. Here you're basically doing this in brackets 0. And That's okay if you know the data model and if you are 100% sure that that element or that thing is always on, the first position. Now, a good example is, for example, if you look into the signing logs, and you have conditional access policies being processed. There's no guarantee that policy number 1 is always going to be, reported and logged as 0, and then your second policy in the second. And there, we can maybe look into that in the next session. You might want to use, for example, MV expand, right? So where you would basically expand that attribute. So you get one line per, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you could filter on a specific thing. Of course, MV expand again will consume more resources because it basically, if you knew constantly that there is just a 0 element and not more, then it's not needed. But I've seen now and then where I was so sure there's always just one sub-element, and then suddenly you get more of them. Yeah.
No, that's a good tip, Alex.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Anything else on either of the slides?
No, thank you for that insight. Yeah.
Cool.
Good. Johnny, anything from you?
Yes, of course. Let me take the screen. So this month I've been playing with the DNS data events. If you go to data connectors and find DNS, you have this data connector where you can ingest the DNS events from Windows to create cool stuff on it. And so what I did is in my test environment, this morning I connected a new domain controller, have it collect. And once we look at the configuration of the data connector, we can see that you have 2 steps. First, you have the connecting of the DNS servers, which require to be Arc enabled, or need to be in Azure, or you onboard them. And then you deploy a data collection rule, which collects the DNS events. So for this, you add your resources to the data collection rule, then it collects. And you can also make exclusions. So with the data collection filters, with the data collection properties, you can say, hey, I want to exclude certain event types or certain IP addresses. So in this case, you can, if you have a DMZ which you don't want to have in your SIM, you can exclude the IP address or DNS queries. But then, how do you start defining your DNS service, your queries? Because you need to figure out what kind of data do you have in your tenant, how much are you ingesting? Because in my tenant, I don't have a lot of records, but as you can imagine, if you have 10,000, 20,000 endpoints, you want to be able to do filtering on DNS queries. And they also quite made it clear, with the filter, you're excluding events and you're not streaming it. So if you want only to have a specific domain, you can't do it with the filter. And then you maybe are able to look at in the data transformation of the tables itself, but not from here. So in order to find out what is generating which data, first we take a look at the DNS activity logs. And just to show, this morning I created this table. So actually this afternoon, sorry, it started logging, and in like 3 hours it generated about 10,000 records. And that's just a one domain controller, one client network. So it's not doing anything crazy. So if you do this times your 500 or your 1,000 or 10,000 endpoint network, it will get a lot really fast. So Let's start with the beginning. In the last 3 hours, I generated, well, this is what, about 30 megs, so that's not that much. So if you convert it, you can see it's even 3 megabytes on a couple of hours, small environment. But to better understand the data, I started splitting the DNS query. Wait, let me just show it for a second. Because normal in the DNS query, you have the domain that is being locked up. So it can be just the host name, or it can be the full URL, and that depends on your config, on the queries that are being run. So what I first did is I used the split operator on the DNS query, and then grabbed the second to last and the last. So from left, this is -1 is the .com, and -2 is the Azure. So that way I was able to create the host name. So for now, if we just do a thing, you can have a bit of an idea how it looks like. And then what I started doing was grabbing by the hosts. I wanted to see the build size, because the build size is how much you in the end pay for your data. And as you can see, Azure.com is quite a big one, and then Traffic Manager, and also my internal domain, it had some records. Let's also add the count. You can see now that we have about 5,000 hits to Azure.com, and 700 to my domain, 400 to our branch setup. So the next thing I wanted to do is to see where data is coming through. So we have the decount source IP address. I did a decount here in my summarize. One of the arguments was to show all distinct source IP addresses, because then I can know who is performing the query. And in this case, you see in my network, 4 devices started communicating to this address, which is my Defender for Endpoint backend. And as you can imagine, if the environment is bigger, the size will also add. So for instance, if you have a large setup, you maybe want to add like 25 to 50% of all your estate in here. And then you can have a feeling which domains are being contacted by everyone and which are a bit more unique. Or you can also use a filter on the size. You can say, hey, in the last 24 hours, if something has gathered more than a certain amount of storage, then you might want to look at excluding it. And over here, what I also did is I added the minimum time generated and maximum time generated for the specific domains. Because in the process, when you are filtering out which domains you don't want to see, you will see at one point the time generated stopping, because you excluded the domain or the host name of the DNS query. So that was one of the things I played in Kusto last month, just to understand the DNS logging, but also ways to find out which items I would exclude.
Yeah.
Maybe
Because,
let me add to that.
As we discussed last night, I mean, we understand that there's always this balance about cost, but be careful and not just unmindful start disabling domains like, well, Azure, that's Microsoft, that's safe, because exactly on Azure, you might have a rogue Azure blob storage that is pointing there, that's being used to exfiltrate data. And then you would actually miss out on all the nice detection queries that actually come along with this data connector. So once you install this solution from the Content Hub, you get the data connector for the AMA agent, plus the configuration of the data collection and the exclusions. But you'll also get a number of very nice, no, it's not in the essentials, it was in the Windows DNS solution. Yeah, if you do view details, yeah, just click on create. That's a little trick to preview. Don't worry, it's not going to install it. Okay, and now if you look at the analytics rules, go up, please. Yeah. And there you see the analytic rules. So, domain generation based alerts, DNS events related to mining pools, Tor proxies, etc. So that's the whole idea of this connector. But yeah, as Johnny explains, in a larger environment, that of course might also bring you more log data, equal more cost. So the approach that Johnny just showed in a mindful way will allow you to maybe reduce logs that you don't consider as important for your security detection or for auditing purposes. Cool. Okay. Then looking at the clock, we were great in going over the planned time, but as we explained to Purav yesterday, we actually don't have a hard stop time, although being mindful of people's evening or dinner. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And who do we have next month? Because last month we made a mistake. We were actually announcing the person, Henning. Yeah. So everybody who's familiar with the Kusto Detective series, stay tuned and join us next month. Purav, a big thank you for joining us today and bringing the other KQL to the surface to us. Very insightful. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad we could make this happen. I remember suggesting this to Johnny, I think late last year or early last year, and finally made it happen. So thank you.
Okay, good.
Thanks for joining us.
Nice evening. See you next month.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Nice evening.